Hey, this is part 3 to my analysis of Kakarot, so go watch the other 2 if you haven't already. Alright, let's keep going. That's what I thought until I played through the end of the Boo saga. I felt left out of the coolest looking parts, and to some extent, I still feel that way. But during the last fight, I realized this missed opportunity isn't what the game was about. It was always about getting to experience the fastest parts for yourself. At the very last moment, I realized the decision to emphasize the fastest parts of combat is what the developers were building to the whole time. And the final fight with Kid Boo is what gives this choice its zenith. The setup is manufactured from a canon perspective, but the setup is exactly the same as every fight we've seen before. That's not lazy, and that's not a mistake. Goku is about to get blown to bits while trying to launch the Spirit Bomb and needs to fight Kid Boo one last time to create an opening in order to get a clean shot. It's the final bout. Time literally stands still, it's happening so fast. To enhance the feeling of adrenaline, Goku is in overdrive the whole fight without a timer on it. What's more, you spent the whole game doing a delicate dance of timing attack animations to find and exploit openings. Instead of the logical next step of the strictest dance, you're unshackled. You can attack through the pain, desperate for the win. You're trading blows at the same time even, something that doesn't happen anywhere else in the game. These 3 deliberate choices to relinquish the limits of combat are the direct mechanical analogy of what Goku is going through in the story. The important thing here is that games can offer more to experiencing these stories than just watching them play out in a cutscene. Kakarot adds to the layers of the experience through these specific design choices. This is what I needed to experience to understand the intent behind the analogy. The developers were making the fights the most important parts. I only needed to trust that this choice had a purpose, and that its sweet, sweet payoff was coming. They were conditioning you in every fight to play within the boundaries of your enemy, and now those boundaries have disappeared, precisely when, and only when, the story demanded it the most. It's hard to put into words how engaging and exciting that feeling this difference really is. 30 hours of waiting for a moment to attack turns into, I have nothing to wait for. It's now or never. Man, what an incredible and rare dynamic. I can literally think of only one other game that does this well. I hope that bit about the other adapted games didn't throw you off. I actually really like Fallen Order in the same way. You spend the whole game wondering why you're not able to do the coolest stuff this universe has to offer, only to eventually, intimately understand why the developers chose to put you through it. So experiencing the ending is 10 times as powerful. Would a player maybe want to be the one pushing against Boo in the final cutscene? Sure, but I genuinely cannot fault the developers for stubbornly sticking to their combat design the whole way through, while finding just the right moments to place the fights and giving the overarching experience of that choice a truly proper endgame send-off. What a game. What a fight this was. The payoff for the system they wanted us to experience is commendable all on its own. Being the driving factor for the flashy bits wasn't what they were going for. It is expensive to design around that kind of engagement anyway, let alone execute it. The point was also to recreate the show down to the exact details. They chose to take a part of the show that they knew they could adapt well within the goal of fidelity, aiming for a rigid kind of fidelity to the source material rather than adapting it into the medium, especially at this scope, is inherently limiting their design. An especially cruel limitation, exactly because they did so well in adapting a major part of the show in a very unique way. But just because it wasn't as good as it could have been, doesn't mean that what we got isn't valuable. Sure, what could have been sounds amazing, but the system that is here, and the way it was integrated into the story they needed to stick to, is still proof that if you make the choice to place limits on your players, and integrate those limits into the story, you can still create a gameplay experience that embodies what it meant to go through that story. And the payoff can still be worth the whole experience. This one may only work at its best when players intentionally restrict themselves, but still, right. Sorry to pull another twist out at the end, but the whole experience I described hinges on not exploiting the systems within easy reach of the player. The challenge of combat is what gives the system its edge, its bite. Mitigation of the difficulty that creates this challenge is something Kakarot has a hard time with. I briefly mentioned it before, but spamming special moves isn't the only way to breeze through these fights. Overleveling through side quests is very easy, even if it is tedious, and it turns the gameplay structure into a power fantasy when it actually works best with the story through player skill and adaptation. Figuring out what to do in response to an attack you just don't have the health to tank, or learning just how many mistakes you can afford to make in a fight massively contributes to the difficulty. Limits like how much ki an attack takes, blocking capacity, and mobility restrictions force the player to learn their opponent in order to get enough of an edge to win. It creates a specific kind of difficulty that emphasizes a player's ability to recognize these limits and risks, to play around them to overcome a fight. You should have to do this if the experience is about the difficulty of the challenge. All of these aspects are thrown out the window if you're a much higher level. Not only do you have more health than you should, but enemy attacks do less damage as well. This, in tandem with the spamming specials, would be enough on its own to throw off the balance, but you also have access to senzu beans. These are infinitely replenished if you wait long enough, and they fully restore your health in battle instantly. Look, I understand the need to ensure that anyone could make it through your game, but these systems also ensure that any decent player will need to resist using them, so they can fully experience the story through the gameplay. There's also subsystems that are aimed at making the game easier, like the RPG mechanics. These, weirdly, increase certain battle stats at the same time enemies are getting stronger, so you don't really feel a difference. The only difference I actually noticed were the lateral progressions of adding more strikes to your attack combo, which feels amazing compared to the vertical progression of the stats. The vertical progression here is in stark opposition to an alternative where the player would have to figure out how to overcome stronger enemies through skill instead of stats, which sounds way more compelling from both a story and gameplay perspective, even if it would make the game less accessible. I've always found accessibility systems like this to just be lazy, and that's not even touching the scourge that is difficulty sliders. A pretty easy way to make the game accessible but also maintain the optimal level of challenge is to restrict which systems are even available, depending on the difficulty level you have the player set anyway. A more in-depth version would entail altering how the systems operate at a given difficulty level. Easier settings can add in the sensu beans or alter blocking capacity to aid the player more. Simply put, there are better options than what's here. If the point was difficulty through limitations, in order to experience the euphoria of removing those limits in the final fight, then there shouldn't be easy access to systems that mitigate the difficulty. So, that's the bulk of my analysis, and my argument as to why I think this game should be discussed, especially in regards to adapted media. But the rest of this is for those of you wondering what we can really learn from this. Shout out to my game dev viewers. But first, some nitpicks. The game clearly front-loaded its development allocation. By the time you get to the Cell Saga, there's an obvious lack of polish in all but the most significant cutscenes.
I feel a lot better now.
Hey, what's that?
Hey, I guess that settles it then.
Characters awkwardly changing positions, the narrator summarizes an interaction or event that would have been, at the very least, interesting to watch. Iconic moments are just missing. Lines being cut off towards the end of their delivery.
What do you think that you could possibly accomplish in just one day? Leaving so soon? I don't think...
Hell, there's even some classic, I'll just pan up for now, we'll add that in later, moments that they never went back to fill in. I'm sure I'm missing some, and it's not that important. I just noticed that they would rather make new paywalled DLC than polish up what they already have. Hilariously, very few moments in the entire game are lip-synced correctly.
As for the lack of response from the Ginyu Force, I suppose I have you to blame.
Except for those special cutscenes where the characters start suddenly emoting like crazy out of nowhere. It is funny in a vacuum, but I'd imagine it's quite frustrating if you paid full price for this experience. I did really end up liking the music in this game, and most of the way through I realized why. Just listen to these tracks and tell me what you hear. Pretty similar, right? I wonder if that was intentional. Last minor point, but it means a lot to me. The narration absolutely ruins certain parts of the emotional through line. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think I would have ever noticed if it weren't for a certain video on director's cuts, but there's a moment where Vegeta breaks down in front of Frieza. You get to imagine for yourself the humiliation and significance of his failure to match up, dragging Vegeta to tears in front of everyone he's threatened with the power from which he gets so much of his ego. Except you don't get to imagine, you get a narration about how bad he feels, completely sucking out all the emotional tension. This doesn't really have anything to do with the thesis of this video, it just bothered me enough to make it in. Alright, now the stuff we can learn from this. I understand that a direct control design wasn't what Kakarot was going for, but if your aim is to push the boundaries of the medium, don't design for a lack of engagement. Kakarot's placement and style of fighting mechanics are engaging on their own, but become deeply engaging when the story highlights them. The flying and especially the ground mechanics, in contrast, could have been very involving as they are, if they were placed in an environment that engaged with those systems. The lack of any engagement during the important bits combines with the lack of valuable, yet forced engagement in traversing the world to create an experience that is, at face value, confused about what the player should be focusing on, in terms of how much time you have to allocate with which systems. I mean, it took me until the very last fight to realize that the way the fights were set up were the flashy important bits the whole time. The last point I want to make is, if your aim is to entertain rather than challenge, consider why you're making this experience, specifically one sold on its difficulty, in a medium about a participant's ability to engage with that material. I know you might be saying, hey, what do you mean? These fights are totally challenging. It's like the Dark Souls of DBZ. Difficulty is a large part of the experience, for sure, but to challenge a player is to create an experience integrating difficulty into the story, and it's about the story you want the player to feel through the way that difficulty is implemented. This inherently means no mitigations, few workarounds. Otherwise, it's not about the challenge, it's about something else that's kinda difficult to get to. You should strive to make a player internally and mechanically contend with what it means to exist as their character does. To contend with why it is difficult, and why they can't make it easier. They can only learn to overcome with the options they have. In this light, we can determine that Kakarot's difficulty is superficial, not challenging, just hard. To those of you who feel this isn't the case, tell me how you think the difficulty is integrated into the story, and not just, that's the game, or it wouldn't be fun if it were easier. I want you to ponder on utilizing difficulty of progression as a substitute for the challenge of an experience before you answer. There is a difference in how the specific function that creates difficulty is related to the story, if it's even related at all. I think it's clear that Kakarot prioritized adapting a specific aspect of Dragon Ball Z into a gameplay style that could reach the peak that it did, and secondarily prioritized the difficulty as a tool of retention, without really figuring out how to integrate the two. That they wanted difficulty to augment the experience, not exemplify it. If they did want it to represent the story their players should feel through their controllers as much as their hearts, if they wanted the player submerged in this difficulty, instead of just observing it, then why are there so many ways to easily get around it? Thanks for sticking around if you made it this far. I'm already blown away at the support I received for my Fallout analysis, so rest assured another one about Fallout 2 and 3 are coming. In the meantime, I've got some interesting thoughts on Dead Island, so join me next time for another shorter video like this one. Thanks again. I'll see you around.